Welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program. Thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, Daniel Davis. I'll tell you, every once in a while we have just an exciting show, and we're going to have one of those today to where it takes you into realms of understanding things a little clearer, especially when it comes to our past. Here in the new 2008, we're looking at some fiery storms that are happening on the political horizon as we're about to elect a new president, and hopefully kind of push the old one behind, if you will, but not saying that in a crass way. But the fact is that people have been unsatisfied for a lot of years. But what I always found most interesting as I'm out there in the general public talking with people is this, is sometimes their views and their opinions when it comes to the world of politics. And it seems to me that most of the time when you listen to these conversations, you're listening or hearing nothing more than sound bites that you probably picked up on a radio station or perhaps some political show that you've heard on another radio station or television station. And that's about the depth of it. I myself, I follow politics, but I don't concern myself with being an expert at them, and our show doesn't usually do political type talks when we do have a show. But this one here, I just couldn't resist. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is author of a new book that is out, and it's something that I'm very excited about bringing on the program here, and it's simply titled Pure Goldwater. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is former Senator Barry Goldwater's son, Barry Goldwater Jr., joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. And Barry, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join us here today.
Well, it's my pleasure, and thank you for having me.
You know, sometimes you almost think that you can't live long enough to tap some of the roots that can really take you back. Now, I remember growing up as a child back in the day, in 1964 was the year I was born, and when the Nixon administration came into play, and I was very familiar with Vietnam even at that age, as I had a stepfather who went off to the Vietnam War. And it was interesting when the producer says, hey, we should do a program on this. And I looked at it and I thought, this not only digs up some really fascinating history, but sometimes can also show you that even though people feel helpless in the realm of politics and politicians, there are some true hardcore people like your father that did the job with integrity and an unyielding American spirit. Tell us about your father.
Well, those are very kind words you spoke about him, and I have to agree. He was a very unique man in the realm of our history of our country. He was a man of the West. He
wrote Clint Eastwood or John Wayne, in other words.
Well, he had strong beliefs about freedom and about individual rights. He had principles that did not change because of popular opinion. I grew up under him, and he taught me about God. He taught me about honesty and values toward other people. I remember growing up that he told me that what he learned from his father, that all men are created equal. He said, and he told me, and it's in this book, I love my fellow man, be he white, black, or yellow. I'm vitally interested in his well-being, for that well-being is my well-being. My father, Senator Goldwater, was way ahead of his time. He was a member of the NAACP in Phoenix, Arizona, and back in the 50s, he desegregated the airport, the National Guard, the theaters, his own business. He was a man that when you asked him a question, you got a straight answer. And I think that's why he's so well respected across party lines. He was not vindictive. He wasn't mean. He believed in the American spirit, and most of all, he believed in the freedom of Americans. And he felt that our Constitution was founded on freedom, and that government comes from the people. It comes from the people at the local level, up through your city council, your city government, your state, and then to the federal government. We, the power of our government, it does not just be automatic. We give it to them. But before the government to do something for us, they have to first take it away from us. And my father fought all his life for personal and individual liberty and personal freedom.
Now, Barry, we didn't get the chance to receive the book, which I hope that does happen, because to me, as I was reading just through the brief profile that we received, which actually has his memos, and just to let the listeners know that Pure Goldwater was written with mostly his memos. Now, what was that all about, just to let our listeners get a better idea?
Well, my co-author, John Dean, who happened to be Richard Nixon's legal counsel during Watergate, and I were roommates in high school. We've known each other all our life, and he was very close to my father. He and my father were going to write a book about the wayward Republican Party when my father became ill and eventually died. In that process, we found my father's journals, which everyone thought were lost. And these are raw, unedited, personal memos that he made to himself over a period of about 50 or 60 years.
My goodness.
His experiences from his early childhood through his service in the military, on up through his political career, and even to the point when he retired. They're raw, uncut, unvarnished. They're behind the scenes of his counseling Richard Nixon, of his relationship to John F. Kennedy, of his frustration with the lack of progress in the Congress. He talked about the filibuster and how at one time he thought he was going to vote against it, and only to turn around and realize that the minority had to be protected, and that's why the filibuster was important. So John Dean and I found these memoirs, and we put them into a book with very little commentary from us. So it's raw, pure Goldwater.
It's really insightful, too, to really get to understand politics, the political process, and the responsibilities when people can really, truly hold their course, as your father, Barry Goldwater, did, especially in such an area where many of us know there's just a lot of deceit, there's a lot of just crazy stuff going on. And here was a quote from one of his journals that really, to me, really embodies the measurement of how people should understand the process before forming opinions. And it says here, and I quote, this is from January 1953, and this is from him on becoming a member of the U.S. Senate. I can truthfully say that these few days had constituted a period of the greatest physical and mental disturbance I have gone through in my lifetime. It is exceedingly difficult for me to describe the sudden realization of the extreme responsibilities that rest upon the shoulders of a senator. Now, you've had that experience. What was that like for him to realize, boy, have I stepped into one heck of an arena?
Well, I happen to have gone through that same experience when I was first elected to the House of Representatives. Mm-hmm. You really wonder, what the hell are you doing here? Because you go from your simple life back home, where you know where the grocery store is, you know your friends, and all of a sudden you're thrown into the Capitol building and the seat of our government, and it is overwhelming experience. He described it, I think, a lot better than I could in that passage that you just read. But it's an overwhelming experience to go through. But you know something? You go through it, and you come out the other side, and you work hard, and you become as effective as anyone else that's there. Because everybody that goes there basically has that same kind of feeling of, the feelings that he expressed.
Mm-hmm. Now, he is considered a conservative. Now, he began to, as you said earlier in the program, begin to see a waning of the so-called conservative Republican Party. So what was going on? And kind of describe what a conservative, I guess, point of view or value is, so people understand what that is, and why he began to see that particular party, especially as was mentioned, the right conservative religious movement that started swaying that Republican Party into a totally different direction.
Okay, I'll do the best I can and keep it as simple as I can. If you are a conservative, you believe that you believe in the worth of an individual. Okay. That our country was founded on freedom of the individual. And a conservative seeks to both expand individual liberty and to resist the accumulation of power by those who claim to know what's best for everyone else. He is reluctant to ask the federal government to do anything for us. He would first like to see if we can't do it ourselves, and that's the genesis of a conservative. We're all spiritual beings, and a spiritual being wants to be free. Each of us are individuals. We are born into this world. We're not the same. We don't think the same. We don't want the same. Our experiences are unique. Our ambitions are different. And only if you are free are you able to seek out and do what you want to do with your life. Not everyone wants to be a millionaire. Not everyone wants to be a teacher. We're all different. But freedom allows us the unique ability to go and do what we want to do. And so he would resist government hampering or getting in the way of these desires and ambition. Right now, today, the Small Business Administration in Washington calculated that it costs a small businessman $7,000 a year just to comply with regulations that have been put forth mostly by the federal government. That's $7,000 per employee. Now, that's $7,000 that businessman could use for his employee salaries, products, marketing, but it costs him to comply with all these regulations. Now, that's an obstruction of the businessman's freedom. Mm-hmm. So, a conservative would not encourage the federal government, and a conservative, on the other hand, in terms of foreign policy, would demand that we protect our country. So therefore, we need a strong national defense, a strong Army, Navy, and Air Force. Mm-hmm. But a conservative would not be going out and empire building, becoming the policeman of the world. He would instead use his diplomatic strength, his economic strength, his commerce, and just the example that this country gives to the rest of the world in ways of protecting this country, and only using force at the last, if absolutely necessary.
And you can see now, just based on your description, how when you look at the Republican or even the Conservative Party, how even your own father became concerned, and how the world even starts looking at us now that, here's America, their conservative values are pushing us around. But where did that turn happen where it kind of moved away from exactly what you're describing?
It's hard to pinpoint. I guess if you want to take a look at, when and where it started, probably you can go back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt with the so-called New Deal, when he greatly expanded the role of government in our lives. And then, of course, John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson picked it up, and we had all kinds of programs that we call entitlement programs. These are programs that promise things such as Social Security and Medicare, and now we have prescription drugs. We have No Child Left Behind. These are all federal programs that have to be paid for, and they are paid for out of the earnings of hardworking Americans. You can only drain the country's resources or the creative geniuses of the individual so much before he says, to hell with it. I'm getting on the other side of this equation and put my hand out.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where you can see a lot of frustration with what's going on now. What's really interesting, too, about, again, the information I was able to receive from your father is just the idea that you get to tap into what was going on in the arenas, through several presidencies. Your father was around for quite a long time. But there were a lot of people that I've asked this question. I'm kind of shady myself because I should look into the matter more, but let's talk about Richard Nixon now. He had a good relationship. Were they friends?
They were friends for some 30 years.
30 years.
Yeah.
And what I was curious about is, what was Watergate and what happened that took Richard Nixon down where he had to resign? Because your dad was also part of the process of the committee, as I understand.
he went to the White House and told Richard Nixon that he had to resign. He didn't have the votes to get through a impeachment hearing in the United States Senate. But going way back when Richard Nixon was a United States Senator from California, they were friends. And then Richard Nixon, of course, became the vice president under General Eisenhower. And then he ran for president against John F. Kennedy and lost. And then he became president in his own right in 1968. Through all of this, my father was a supporter of Nixon, and they were friends. He did question Nixon's conservative credentials throughout all of this, but most importantly, during the Watergate scandal, which started about 1972, and it was a petty crime. Some people who worked for the president broke into the Democrat headquarters, and we don't really know what they were looking for, but they got caught, and everyone in the Nixon administration denied any affiliation or responsibility, and it went on for a couple of years before finally information got out that the president could have known about it, and of course the president denied it. Eventually, it resulted in his stepping aside. Now, in the middle of all this was John Dean, my co-author. Mm-hmm. John Dean worked for Nixon, and John Dean knew what was going on, and he knew that the president knew. And John Dean was called to the Senate to testify during the hearings about Watergate, and he had to tell the truth. As a matter of fact, before he went up to testify, he met with my father because John was torn between his loyalty to the president and his sense of right and wrong. And so they met together at my house one afternoon, and John explained to him what he was going to testify about. And my dad says, John, go there and tell the truth and nail that son of a bitch. My father had become totally hurt. He was frustrated. He was disappointed in Nixon and his friendship because Nixon had lied to him. Mm-hmm. And so that's how John Dean got involved in all this. And he was good friends with my dad. And when we found this journal, we decided that this was too good just to be sitting in a box. And we put together Pure Goldwater. And it's a lot of fun to read because you get to kind of see what goes on behind the scenes. He was close to many presidents. Gerald Ford asked him to be the vice president, and he turned him down. He and John Kennedy in 1964 were going to run against each other for president, and they were going to fly around on the same airplane. Mm-hmm. And in a Lincoln-Douglas debate format, stop in a city and get up on the stump and tear each other up, get back on the plane, and go to the next city. But, of course, when the president was assassinated, the dream went out the window and died. So his influence in the history of this country was, I think, significant. And he was well-liked because he was always honest, he was always straightforward, and he was never malicious or personal.
It just, again, there was just so much that we could talk about, that there's never enough time, it seems like. But besides, I'm sure that you've done a lot of programs and shows where people really want to know, well, what do you think your dad would think about the presidential race that's going on today? I think what's significant is the fact that you actually have a woman and an African-American or a black man running for president, which, to me, I think a lot of Americans feel encouraged because there's the hope of change on the horizon, a way of trying to maybe correct, which may take some time. But knowing that could be part of this book and not really wanting to get into that, it's more interesting to also find out about the man himself. Now, anybody who's ever been in political office realizes there's a lot of time commitment. So what was that like, and how did he balance his professional life with his personal one? Because to me it sounds like he really had time for his family as well.
Well, in politics, your family is always last. It's hard on a family for a political person because he was never home. When I was growing up, I very seldom saw my father because during the Second World War, he was gone for 4 years over in Europe and Asia. And then when he was home for a while, but then he had to go back to Washington, D.C. as a United States Senator. And we only saw him every once in a while. But in spite of that, he was it wasn't quantity but quality time that he spent, and it was good time. He took the time to teach us right from wrong. He used to take us camping up in the mountains, and he said, you know, when you're walking in the mountains and in the forest, you're walking with God, and that's strong and powerful. And don't ever forget that. There were a lot of values that he taught us, even though we didn't see him that much. So he was a good father, but he was probably a better statesman. And the family got along. All the kids, there's 4 of us, all grew up okay. Nobody got thrown in jail. Nobody got
even
busted.
Good families sprout out children that just do that anyway. So.
Well, but he taught us to stand on our own 2 feet. He kicked us all out of the house after college and told us to go out and stand on our own 2 feet and take care of ourselves. So, you know, that's what we all have done, and we've all turned out okay. I thought it was a wonderful opportunity, and I felt blessed to be able to serve with him in the United States Congress. We both were the co-authors of an act that prohibited the further use of the Social Security number to track people in lists unless the Congress authorized it. And that was passed and signed into law. But it wasn't too long after that Senator Russell Long authorized its use to track down aid for dependent children's fathers. And so that was short-lived, but we got together on that. We got together on a legislation, the Privacy Act of 1974, which I was a co-author on, and he was in the Senate. And it was the first time that privacy had ever been tried to be codified or to put into law to protect individuals from the snooping eye of government. The Privacy Act has been very, very powerful, and unfortunately, with the Patriot Act and some of these other things after 9/11, I think we need to take a hard look at whether our privacy is truly being protected or not.
It certainly doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have an act like that and then demand that we have this protecting army and military when in the meantime what we should be protecting is ourselves from our own government. How would you think your father would respond to the question today, especially if you were to sit and talk about this with other people, of the course of the government and how the American experiment is moving? What direction do you see it moving into? Do you think it'll just keep getting worse as government gets larger, or do you feel that it's going to actually get back to the original way that it was intended?
That's the $64 question, and in the book Pure Goldwater, he asks the same question. He says, have we gone too far, and are we now going downhill? He didn't have an answer for that question, because we're still a pretty resilient country. We all perceive that we're free, but government takes a little bit out of each and every one of us. And I think my personal opinion is we are heading towards socialism, and that means a loss of our personal freedoms. Your listeners, each and every one of them, have worked very hard for the money that they have, their investments, their savings, and yet every time we turn around, our government, because of monetizing the debt, is through inflation decreasing the value of those savings. Now, that's not the kind of government we want or deserve. We need a government that will keep our economy stabilized. And you can't have a stable government when you spend more money than you take in, because you have to finance it. So we sell our bonds to China and to Japan and to the Middle East, and as a consequence, the value of our dollar keeps going down. So we've lost a lot of good leadership in this country. whether we can recover and reduce the size of our government, reduce our taxes. That's the $64 question, and it all depends on your listeners and on the citizens of this country. If they just take a little more interest in what's going on, like Thomas Jefferson said, eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. And if you're not watching out, it may be too late.
Again, it's such a pleasure to have you on the program, to realize that even as corrupt as people believe the government can be, that there are still those hardened, seasoned individuals in there that are trying to continually do the right thing and are doing the right thing to try to keep us on course with the original spirit of what we were talking about earlier, which is the United States Constitution. Kind of to sum things up a little bit here as we come to the close of our show, I know that he was really adamant, your father, Barry Goldwater, about how he sort of disdained the media and how they talk about things. And I'd like you to kind of describe that a little bit, because I feel the same way in so many ways. And just, what was his outtake on that?
Well, the press attacked my father back in the 60s, and especially when he ran for president in 1964. Much of the press in those days were a throw-off of the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt era of liberalism, mostly liberalism stemming from the East Coast. They attacked him viciously, and but today I think the press, because we have so many different outlets today, is a little bit different. I think the press today is trying to be a little more informed. I think you still see bias here and there, but fortunately we have other choices for our news and for information, and that's a good thing.
That's
in those days,
actually. I was saying that's an amen, actually.
Well, yeah, in those days, you just had a few people that dominated the news. You had 3 networks, you had a few powerful newspaper writers and columnists, and they pretty much dominated the political thought. But today you do have opportunities for choice, and I think that's healthy.
Now, just imagine, through this whole process, your father was married to your mother, Peggy, I understand, for some 50 years, and he also talks about what it was like to be married for 50 years to this wonderful woman, because it couldn't have been easy to be the wife of a politician. And I'm sure it probably even got more challenging for your mom as he retired, because as he was saying in one of his memos, you retire and that means half the pay and twice the husband.
The love affair between my mother and my father was exemplary and beautiful. When they first met, then he fell in love with her. He chased her all over the country. She was from Indiana and would come out to Arizona in the winters. And there was in his journal he talks about that this train that my mother was on made stops to fill up with coal and water, and at each stop he would have a gift for her, waiting for her, and a letter. He chased her for a couple of years, and finally he cornered her in a phone booth in Muncie, Indiana, and he told her, he said, "Peggy," he says, "I'm running out of patience and out of money. I want you to marry me right now. Yes or no?" And she said yes, and they got married, and it was tough on my mother because he was never home, and I saw her often crying and lonely because of that. And I know that he looked forward to retiring and spending some time with her. Unfortunately, she died right after he retired, and they never did have that dream that they both wanted to come true.
Yeah, being the wife of somebody who actually stands for something like your father did, that's never easy, but it's also something that I'm sure she was very proud of as well.
Well, she was, and she was very much a part of his life. She had the responsibility of raising the kids, and she did a good job there. And she was always there. She was always there for him. And there was a love affair that was very deep. But it was not easy on either one of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, the book is Pure Goldwater. Our guest joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is Barry Goldwater Jr., Barry Goldwater's son, talking about the book Pure Goldwater and just finding out and getting some really good insight from the man himself about who he was, what he thought, and it's definitely unedited. And just as you were talking about how your dad proposed to your mother, he's a very straightforward, told you what was on his mind kind of an individual, and it sure would be nice if we can have those kind of experiences, not just with our politicians, but even with our neighbors and our friends. Just be above ground. Tell me what's on your mind and speak the truth. And living that way, one can understand what walking with true integrity must feel like. And obviously, you've lived and embodied that same thing all of your life as well.
Well, there's nothing better than honesty. If you live an honest life, you can always be proud.
Very good. Well, I'd like to again thank you for joining us here on the program today. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Well, thank you very much.
You bet. Again, for the listeners out there, we've been speaking with Barry Goldwater Jr., son of former Senator Barry Goldwater, and the book is simply titled Pure Goldwater. We want to encourage you today to be sure to visit our website at beyond50radio.com, where we'll have more information about this. And also thank you for listening today. So just simply go on to beyond50radio.com, that is 50 with a 50, sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter and find out more about our show. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in today. And remember, live your day past halfway.